everyone. Welcome. My name is Cindy McDonald, and I'm glad to welcome you here to the next in our interviews. This is our series of exploring paths to higher education for Guided Path, and we have been interviewing subject matter experts from all over the world talking about topics that are important to us and to our students. And I'm very pleased today to have with me a special guest, Kristina Dooley. She is the founder and also CEO of Estrella Consulting. Welcome, Kristina.
Thanks, Cindy. I'm happy to be here.
Glad to have you here. So we're going to talk about international students and that path to higher education for them. And, leaving their home, coming from a foreign country to the United States is a growing trend. We see a lot of students doing that. And especially in the future, the number of US students is starting to level off and might even decrease. So more and more colleges are looking at what they need to do to build their international student population. So I want to talk to you about some of these topics. You've been working with international students for how many years? Tell us a little bit about your background in working with international students.
Okay, I can do that. So I started my professional career in education working in higher ed in college admission, and then actually transitioned to be a director of admission at a boarding school here in Ohio. And that was when I began working with international students, doing some international recruitment and interviewing, some travel, all of those kinds of things. And then I transitioned to be an independent educational consultant almost 9 years ago. And I did that actually when I moved to São Paulo, Brazil for my husband's job, and started working with international students at that point, and have since lived throughout Latin America and Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, and now I'm back in Ohio, but I continue to work with international students as well.
So how do you know, when you work with these students, how do you know if a student is an international student?
A student would be considered an international student. There's really one litmus test with most institutions, and that is, do they have U.S. citizenship, or are they a permanent resident of the U.S.? If they are not an international student. So a student who has U.S. citizenship that's living in Peru, for example, even if they've grown up in Peru, if they are a U.S. citizen by paper, they would be applying as a domestic student, which is kind of perplexing for a lot of families, because they feel like it should be based on where you're coming from, where you'd be entering the institution of higher education from, when in reality it is based on citizenship or permanent residency.
And I think that's one of the things that's not only confusing for parents and families, but what about the colleges? How do the colleges handle that?
And that's really that's an institutional decision in terms of how the applicant is reviewed. They would be applying, though they'd be applying as a domestic student. It's very possible that within an admission office, in an applicant review, that they may actually have their international admission folks reviewing that applicant, mainly because when a student's coming from abroad, their transcripts will certainly not look necessarily just like those coming from a domestic student applicant. And so those who are trained on working with international students and reviewing international transcripts and translations, they would be the ones probably doing that initial read. I will say there are a lot of institutions now, though, where there are so many people within the admission office that are well-versed in reviewing an international applicant in terms of the paperwork, even if they hold U.S. citizenship, that they'll just do it as a domestic. But I guess the blanket answer is it depends on the institution, because there is no cut and dry. If you have a U.S. passport, you will always be viewed this way in an admission situation. That's not the case. The one piece I think that comes into play sometimes is in terms of testing. So let's say, again, I use my Peruvian student example. They grew up in Lima. Their main language is Spanish. Do they have to take a TOEFL if they are a U.S. citizen? So that's another question that comes up sometimes and is very institution specific. If a student's first language is not English, though they are a U.S. passport holder or a U.S. citizen, they may still have to take a TOEFL. So the institutions make those determinations.
That makes a lot of sense,
Mm-hmm.
because comparing transcripts, just because you hold a U.S. citizenship, your transcript, your foreign language, English may be your second language. And
Right.
you have to be, it's like you're wearing two hats as a student.
Exactly. And I would say also on that same line is that one of the points that's a little bit confusing for students as well is, let's say one of their parents is a U.S. citizen and therefore they are a U.S. citizen and their other parent is not. And so they're maintaining dual citizenship. When they're applying, I've had students ask me, can I apply using my Peruvian example, as a Peruvian citizen? You will not apply as a Peruvian citizen. If you have U.S. citizen, you must, even if you're a dual citizen, you must apply as a U.S. citizen. The reason why is if you only indicate on your application your Peruvian citizenship, for example, then what that does is that triggers an I-20 for the visa process. And therefore, if you try to apply for a student visa to enter the U.S. as an international student, but in reality, you actually already are a citizen, then obviously that gets negated. So that's a good thing to know as well, that if a student has dual citizenship, their U.S. citizenship would be the one that they would be applying under to any U.S. institution.
That makes total sense. And yet something that would not be evident to a family looking at that process. And that's why having someone like yourself to help them walk through all those steps can be such a valuable resource.
Mm-hmm. And it doesn't mean that they wouldn't put their other citizenship on their application. I should say that they would still indicate that they've got both of those. And that does come into play, that, in terms of the review, some colleges will count them in multiple categories when they're doing their record keeping and statistics of their incoming class. They will count both citizenships in their incoming class.
So what would you say are the top 3 challenges that international students face in coming to the United States for their undergraduate study?
That's a great question. I think for many of my students, one of the hardest things has really been integrating into their student population, meaning not that there's a temptation to stick with what and for example, in my case, I work with many native Spanish speakers, and so their temptation is to find other native Spanish speakers on campus, and that tends to be their friend group. And so they do miss out in a lot of ways on what they're kind of looking for, in terms of a traditional U.S. college experience. So I think that transition piece and really opening themselves to integrating into the student population and not just driving towards their comfort zone, which is, again, to be with folks who are just like them or from their home country. Another thing I would say is, even though these students are young adults, and they've in many ways are much more mature than some of their peers, they still experience a tremendous amount of homesickness. And in Portuguese, there's actually a word, when my Brazilian students would say they'd had saudades, which is, it doesn't have a literal English translation, but it essentially means when you are really sad about not having something from home or a feeling of home. And I have that with my students coming from all over the place to the U.S., where they are so confident that they're going to acclimate just fine because they've, many of them are 19, 20 years old by the time they come to the U.S., but they really even small things that might seem trivial, but small things like food, depending on where they go to college, depending on the environment. If they go to a school that's relatively remote and they don't have access to a grocery store that maybe carries things that they're used to from home, that can make a difference, actually.
It can make a huge amount of difference. We face that even in our region, with a strong Hispanic influence. Missouri doesn't have a whole lot of tacos tortillas, It's like, what are you going to do?
It's true. And I think that's one of the things that, when my international parents ask, what can we send them for care packages? And I say, food, send the food, because the food makes them happy. And then I would say a third challenge actually is a little further on, not necessarily their initial transition to university in the US, but is almost thinking of beyond. My students have a lot of trouble deciding, will I go back home or will I seek employment in the US and then have to have a sponsor, or do I go to graduate school in the US? It's the, what am I going to do after this, that they aren't thinking of when they first come, but usually around sophomore year it hits them that they need to make a decision about that, because they do need to start planning about what their next steps are. And is it feasible for them to go back home and get a job, or do they want to stay in the US and eventually, work towards being sponsored by an employer to be here, and then maybe even working towards citizenship, and that's something when they get their student visas, their home countries are giving them the visas with the understanding that they will come back home. And so they're in visa interviews, oftentimes, especially students from Asia, there will be questions in the visa interview about their intentions in terms of, will you be returning back to China, for example? And they need to say yes. They need to be, because they don't want a mass exodus of their brightest students going and never coming back and bringing that education back with them. They want them to return to support the economy there, and to better their environment. And so that is a challenge as well.
It is, and that's becoming a lot more, coming out in the media. It's getting a lot more focus and attention in the recent months. What countries do you know are sending the most students to study in the U.S.? What would you say would be the top three countries that are doing that?
First, let me tell you about a great resource. So there's something called the Institute of International Education, and every year they produce something called the Open Doors Study. And the Institute of International Education is funded by the U.S. government. And so the great thing is that the data that they provide about education throughout the world, actually, it was really interesting. But they do the study every year, and they will list the numbers of students that are coming in, the numbers of students that are going out, where are those students coming from. The most recent report is from 2015-16, and in that report, they reported that in the US alone, there were over 1 million international students in the United States. And to your comment at the beginning, Cindy, about the leveling off of domestic student enrollment and this need or want from institutions to look outside of our borders for students, these numbers are growing, and growing rapidly as well in terms of the number of students that are coming. And so the top three, based on that report, let me talk about the first two, are China and India, and they make up actually almost 50% of that million students coming to the U.S. So almost half of the students that are coming from abroad to come to U.S. institutions, and this, I should say, this covers both undergraduate and graduate studies, but almost 50% are coming from those two countries alone. The third is Saudi Arabia, and that actually has changed over I look at this report every year and have done so for at least the last 9 years, and I know that number their place on the list has changed and has moved up. So now they're currently in the number 3 position, with far fewer. I'm just looking at my notes right here. So it's about 5.9% are from Saudi Arabia. But when you're thinking about those other two countries and how many students are coming from those two places, one of the things I wanted to mention too was that what's happening now is, and I mentioned that I worked in boarding school admission, is that this international entry into the U.S. is actually happening on the secondary school level, and it's because the students coming from China, primarily China, they're not seeing this mass influx of students coming from India going to U.S. secondary schools, but China certainly. China makes up almost half of secondary school students coming in from abroad. And I don't even say boarding school students, because there are not enough spaces in U.S. boarding schools now to handle the influx of students coming from China without with maintaining a balance of international to domestic student populations in those schools. So now a lot of day schools and public schools are hosting international students, primarily coming from China. So anyway, it's interesting how students are trying to get in earlier into the U.S. education system so that they can have a leg up in the application process applying to U.S. colleges.
Yes, and I've seen, and you've seen reports about that, how that is growing. And I know a lot of, especially boarding schools or even day schools, if allowed, they could fill their whole classes just with Chinese students, right?
Mm-hmm. And the reality is that I mentioned that piece about the difficulty of international students, the challenge of integrating into your student population, and not just really clustering with those who are just like you. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of the boarding schools have put caps on the numbers of students that they have coming primarily from China and South Korea. Those tend to be the two countries that send the most students to boarding school. And the reason why is if you've got a boarding population of 200 and you've got 50 students from China, that actually does change the dynamic within the school environment. And truthfully, from my experience working with those international families when I was in the boarding school side of things, they did not want that. They didn't want their student to be going to a school. They wanted them really, first of all, practicing their English skills, working on that, which they're not doing that if they are going back to the dorms. And same thing in higher education. If the students aren't able to really fully immerse themselves in the U.S. culture and language, that can be a challenge for them.
Yes, it can be. Both the students that they're going to school with that are the domestic students and the students that are coming as international students too.
Absolutely.
So how what are the new challenges that international students are going to be facing? And we're seeing some changes. I just noticed a report today that colleges are reporting the number of international students attending or applying is dropping. So what are some of the new changes arising for international students?
I think the challenges for international students, obviously, and the current political climate in the U.S. is making it challenging for a lot of students. I think that if you read some of the studies like that NACAC is participating in, for example, right now, and NASFA, and also this group that does the Open Doors study is part of that too. What they're finding, that report, for those, the full report should be coming out hopefully in the next week or so. But what they've found is that they're seeing, I think this won't be so surprising to people, but they are seeing decreases in students coming from the Middle East, and in terms of applicants that they had normally seen increases. And I mentioned, we've seen some rising in some of those areas over the last couple of years, and now this is going back down for this year. And really on the flip side, the other report that's coming out are from the schools in Canada seeing increases of applicants to the Canadian universities and the University of Toronto, University of British Columbia. They've just released some data on their enrollment and application numbers this year. And we're not talking 2 or 3% increases. We're talking 25, 35. I mean, we're talking big increases from certain parts of the world. And so I think that the uncertainty of our time right now in terms of who can come, who can go, who can stay, who can't, those are all the questions that international families have. And for parents, and I would say this isn't limited to the Middle East, because as I mentioned, I work with students throughout Latin America, and a significant number of students. And it's a concern for them as well in terms of, should my child go to school in the US, and then we don't know if perhaps our country might get put on a travel ban, or something like that. So there are concerns like that for families right now that I think a couple years ago were not as concerning, for people, and they weren't thinking about those things.
Yeah, I was having a conversation this last week, and somebody, and he was saying, well, I'll have students from Ghana and Nigeria and Somalia. I was like, well, wait, that's one of those countries on the list. He's like, well, yeah, I hadn't thought about that. So yeah, there's a lot of things for people to think about and to consider. So as a counselor, if I'm interested in expanding my practice or my school, my nonprofit group to be more inclusive international students, what do I do? How do I do that?
That's a great question. There are a lot of really great resources that exist internationally in markets where I think they could use some support from all of those different groups that you just mentioned. Education USA is doing a lot of work in obviously various parts of the world. What I always tell my colleagues is that if you're interested in working with students from a particular part of the world, for example, I mentioned the China boom, is what people have been referring to it as, is that there are many students coming from China, or students who would like to come from China, I should say, because their possibilities are unknown yet. But the reason why is they've got, many people feel like there's a lot of income and wealth that can send those students to the US. But actually, there are a lot of middle-class families in China who have children that are looking to come to the US and may not necessarily be full pay families, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one of the things that if someone is interested in working pro bono, or if they're working for a nonprofit group or something like that, there are opportunities. This is not a case where it's just wealthy Chinese families that are looking, to send their children to the U.S. There's a growing number of middle-class families that could certainly use some assistance. I've always found that if and I had a different situation because I actually was living in the locations where many of my international students were from, and I had the opportunity to connect with the embassies there. They've got education liaisons. They've got people that are working with families to help find opportunities for them internationally. And through Education USA, which usually works in partnership with many of the embassies abroad, they have programs, they sponsor webinars. Maybe you can present a webinar to a group of students. You don't have to be on the ground there. There's a lot you can do virtually to either, if you're trying to promote yourself as an independent consultant, or if you're working for a nonprofit or something like that, and you just like to expand your offerings and what you can provide. I know that they're always looking for content, whether it's visual content like that, or even a great example was that when I lived in Sao Paulo, I wrote an education column for the American Society of Sao Paulo, had a newsletter that went out to families, and they didn't have an education section. So I proposed this to them and said, what if I wrote a monthly education column on different topics so that families looking to go to whether it was secondary school or university in the US, I gave them information on things that they should know. So there's a lot of opportunities like that to share your knowledge internationally. The other thing is, I would say, partnerships in some ways with folks who are on the ground in those locations. So if there's a place that you think there's an opportunity to work with students, again, using China as an example, there are consultants and consulting groups springing up all over the place throughout China. And I would say that many of them are looking for partnerships with people on the ground in the US, because we have the ability, for example, if a group of students will be coming to the US to visit schools, knowing that they've got somebody here on the ground that can help with the logistics of that, or even meet the group and go with them on their tours or those kinds of things, that's really valuable for them. The one caveat I would say is that it's really important to vet any of those people, no matter what country they're coming from, to vet those people to make sure that they're doing things ethically. I would even go so far as even showing them a copy of the NACAC statement of principles of good practice and those kinds of things, because to let them know this is how I do things. I need to understand that this is also how you will be doing things, because you don't want to be aligned with someone that maybe is not doing things the way that you would like your name associated with. So.
Absolutely. I'm glad I would reiterate that as well, because there's more and more. We see them at our conferences, we get them in our emails, and making sure that you vet them. You don't want to connect yourself to a company or organization that doesn't abide by the standards and ethics.
Right.
And we all know the standards and ethics in other countries are different. They're
Mm-hmm.
different cultures, and NACAC has addressed that very, um, you know, deliberately over the last several years, and has a guidelines and things too. So I think those
Mm-hmm.
are very valuable to use. So
Mm-hmm.
that's all very good advice. um, so we have a question from someone who says, if you're interested in expanding your practice to work with international students, this is from Angel, how do you attract those populations from a marketing standpoint? You mentioned some different things you can write, and how do you get in touch with them in the first place?
That's a good question. So one of the ways also that I think has been valuable for me and has been a good way to attract families is if you are, for example, an independent consultant and you're trying to grow an international student population, you need to make it very clear in, for example, your web presence or posting of blogs that are specific to topics dealing with international, because then they will look to you as an expert in that field and know that you actually you know what the process is like for them. And I get inquiries frequently from articles either that I've written on my own blog or on LinkedIn, or through websites. There are a lot of websites that are geared towards international students or expat students even going through this process. And so again, and I'm a little bit, I think my situation might be different than others in that I have a master's degree in journalism, so I like writing. so that's a little different. Some people I know that they may not be their forte, but for people to find you, most of the ways that families are finding consultants or groups to work with is looking online. And so if you're not capitalizing on your knowledge by promoting it on your web or on, like I said, on like LinkedIn or anything like that, those are just a couple of ways. I'm a big proponent of I would call it guerrilla marketing as opposed to paid marketing, paid advertisements, because I don't know that those go very far. I definitely think for me, for those who are watching and are independent consultants, I definitely find a lot of value in my memberships in my professional associations in terms of marketing. So even though I'm not physically based on the ground in the locations where I was at one point, the fact that in the directories for IECA, HECA, I listed as an international consultant, or that I have an international designation. So families looking for somebody would know, okay, this is somebody that has expertise in this arena. If you do not feel like you have the expertise up to this point in those arenas, but you would like to become more well-versed on the process for international students, programs through the University of California system and the certificate programs that they have for college counseling and educational consulting, they offer electives in working with international students. And I think they're phenomenal. I think the people that teach them are phenomenal. And I think taking advantage of those kinds of courses, even if it's not completing the full certificate, but taking them as, a standalone class, if you're able to, I think are truly valuable in getting up to speed. Because one thing I would put as a precaution for anyone out there, whether it's a consultant or someone on the school side or nonprofit, is there's a lot involved in working with an international family. If they are truly international, there's documentation, financial documentation that they have to provide that a domestic student does not need to provide. And I can tell you that can be challenging. The process is so different of applying to U.S. universities than it is to almost every other country in the world. And so because of that, if you're working with a family who is not, or a student who's not, they don't understand the process as much. I give you one very quick example. Was one of the very first students I worked with in Brazil came to me in June and said, I've applied to some colleges. I need your help because I've not heard back from them about whether or not I've been admitted. And it's June. And I said, now tell me, what schools did you apply to, and tell me, where did you submit the application? And I'm thinking it was from the previous year application. So we went on, he shows me on a website, we go onto one of the college websites, and he says, I filled out this application and I've not heard anything about whether or not I can go. he had filled out an inquiry form on their website.
Ah,
So I can tell you that the process that we have is very different. Our students don't just take one exam like they do in Brazil that determines what school they go to, same as in China. We have a much more complex system. So you really need to educate yourself on the process for international students before you jump into doing it.
right, right. And that's where having some background or some, experience or some foundation is really key. And I will reiterate what you've said about the online certificate programs. I teach for the UCLA and I teach a special issues class. We spend 1 week on not just international students, but it's international and veterans and undocumented students. I mean, we cover a whole gamut, and that's just 1 week. And there's no way we can cover everything we need to on that topic. So there's a whole class, and that just makes such a difference to have that opportunity and learn about that. Because one of the other topics we're not even going to discuss is the TCK, the third culture kids. And that goes back into, maybe you do have an American citizenship, but you have, lived all your life in the global environment, and how does that affect you coming back? And that's a whole nother topic too. So so we've got more and more questions coming in, and we're running out of time here, but we'll take questions that we don't get to. We'll send them to you, Kristina, and make them available. One other thing I wanted to mention too, for those that are watching, listening, that's one of the things we take into consideration in Guided Path, is that our international students have a different profile. They do have to fill in visas and do finance forms, and it is a very foreign experience for them. So trying to help them manage that is one of the things that we've tried to accommodate through our system. So can you repeat what the study was? It's the Open Doors study, and who does that?
It's the Institute of International Education. And actually, if you just, and maybe we'll list this under the video recording, Cindy, but if you Google IIE Open Doors, you'll find it. And they do it every year. I get excited every year when they release it, because it actually, there's a lot of great summary data. If you're not somebody who wants to, scroll through 50 pages of documentation, they do have some really great small call outs, infographics, all that kind of stuff that is really interesting. And as I mentioned, just in the 9 years that I've been doing this as an independent consultant, this data has changed tremendously. And even, pushing back further, when I was on the boarding school side, it was amazing to me in the short period of time how quickly our China student population, really, they call it the China boom for a reason. It happened very quickly. And so I think we will continue to see some of these changes. And I mean, some of the things that have caused an influx of a student population in the past have been things like Brazil. A handful of years ago, actually shortly after I lived there, they had a scholarship program through the country. It was a Brazilian program for students interested in the STEM fields to go and study. They had partnerships with universities in the US. And because of that, or actually throughout the world, and because of that, there was this huge influx, and then they eliminated the program. And so that number has swiftly declined. Same thing in Saudi Arabia. They actually developed a scholarship program as well. And that has obviously led to an increase with Saudi Arabia now standing in the number 3 spot in terms of number of students coming to the US.
Definitely. Well, thank you. And we'll look up that link and put that in there. Thank you so much. We're glad to have you. This has been so enlightening. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. And just remind people, this is recorded, and we will be posting this. This will be coming to your email box with a link so that you can look at this and listen to this again and pass it on to other colleagues. I would also invite you to join us for our next month interview. We're going to be talking with Maria Schwartz. She's the CEO and founder of Teen Life, and she's going to talk about gap years and how that can help students, and that can be an alternative pathway to education for students as well. Upcoming interviews, we're going to be interviewing Robin Goldberg from Minerva Education. They have a very innovative, revolutionary approach, also very international perspective. So we're going to see that theme throughout the series that we have. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Kristina. We appreciate your time. And everybody have a great day, and we look forward to seeing you at our next interview.